Hi, my name's Alexis Lowry. I'm curator here at DIA Art Foundation, and I help organize the DIA Talks series, which invites curators, scholars, artists, critics to come help us think through things currently on view at DIA Beacon, and we're so happy to have Jessica Vaughn here today, and Stephen Kwok, our curator of public engagement at DIA. So I'm going to give a brief introduction to this exhibition, which is a little different than most at Beacon, and I'll explain why. And then we're going to have a conversation and hopefully have some time at the end for questions. But I guess if something's burning as we go, raise your hand and we'll make sure it gets addressed. So this installation is the second that we've done at DIA of Charlotte Posenenske's work. Posenenske was an artist who came to prominence in the 1960s, worked for a really intense period of time for about 13 years, and then in 1968 decided that she was going to move on from making visual art and focus on studying the sociology of labor. In the 2 years leading up to her decision to stop making objects, she developed a series of modular sculptural projects, which, for lack of a more eloquent description, I like to describe as Legos for grown-ups. So what you can see here on the walls are the series B and C. The requirement for these series, this is C, it's the yellow ones, are that there be at least two elements that are combined at a given time. They can go on the wall in any pattern. They can be vertical, they can be horizontal. You can mix the angular pieces with the rounded pieces. They're convex, they're concave. You mix and match as you please. Similarly, the series D and the DW series are the elements that look like ducting work, HVAC systems. The DW is the cardboard work, DW for Weltepaper, for cardboard. And like the wall-based works, these can be combined and reconfigured however the consumer, as Posenenske described the people doing the combining, like. So after a retrospective that we organized in 2019, we decided to reinstall the work, this time a little differently. The retrospective had been organized kind of internally, really focused on looking at the kinds of configurations that Posenenske in her own lifetime made. But during the run of the exhibition, we had had a really wonderful session led by Diana Mangazer, an architect who lives in Newburgh, with Stephen Kwok, where we played with models to kind of think about the relationship between 2D and 3D space and how Posenenske got to the actual objects. So we restaged that exercise using models again with everybody who had been at the original session invited back during the pandemic. Luckily, we could socially distance because there's some room here. And used the models. We turned the models that we developed in those sessions over to our art handling teams, who then reinterpreted them and made some practical decisions about what could actually work in real space. So what you end up with here is a kind of crowdsourced installation that I think really models the potentiality of her systems, but also her interest in kind of de-authoring the object or sharing authorship and sharing the labor that goes into making the artwork. So, Posenenske was really interested in the industrial laborer who literally manufactured the object, her own kind of authorship of the original system, but also the kind of shared relationship with a public that happens when the works get configured. So this installation feels as true to the spirit of that as we could get anyway here. So with that long-winded intro, I'm going to briefly introduce Jessica, who I think I first met during the Creative Capital. Yeah. Right?
So back in like 2021.
Yeah. It was a while ago. And I think in that first meeting, I was like, you should come talk about Posenenske with us. So it's been a while. It's been a minute. Took a while to get ourselves organized post-pandemic to do something in person. But I was immediately drawn to the way that you think about labor in your own work, and particularly the way that materials can index a kind of history of labor, which I think is really relevant for today. So, Jessica is an artist who lives and works in Brooklyn. Her most recent artworks in sculpture, video, and photography interrogate questions of labor, race, and architecture. Vaughn's recent exhibitions include her solo show, Our Primary Focus is to Be Successful, at the Institute of Contemporary Art, Philadelphia, and group exhibitions including The Condition of Being Addressable, ICA Los Angeles this year, Hiding in Plain Sight, Pace Gallery, and Lost in America at the Museum Bellpark in Köln, Switzerland. She's a forthcoming solo exhibition at Kunstverein für Rheinlande. You think my German would be better after like 5 years of working on Posenenske, but that's okay, in 2023. So thank you for joining us. And then Stephen and I went to your studio, in April? Yeah. And that was really exciting for us because it turned the kind of like abstract conversation that we had into something really tangible. We got to see some of the things that you're working on right now, which hopefully we'll talk about. But before we do that, Stephen, can I turn it over to you?
Okay, so as a way of introducing ourselves and kind of orienting ourselves before the conversation, we thought about a kind of experiential exercise potentially to lead you all through, kind of drawn from both Posenenske and Jessica's practice. So we'll just take a minute, and I'd like for everyone to, you can close your eyes or not, and we'll take some silence and try to see if we can locate the sound of the HVAC system of this building. And spend a few seconds there first, and then we'll try to find that, and I'll interject more. Okay, if you can find that sound, and also see if you can hear your own, or look for your own breath. Try to hear your own breath, and consider how the two are interacting with each other. Is one more stronger and more legible? Is one at a higher pitch than the other? What are their tempos? How are they interacting, and whether or not they synchronize? Okay, maybe a little bit harder on a busy day in the galleries, but next time you're here, if you're here on a really empty day, maybe that's something to try as well. But thank you all for listening.
So part of the reason we wanted to do that is, of course, because these works very obviously reference HVAC systems, right? The systems that move air, circulate air through the building, that help a building breathe. And we'll get to later in our conversation some work that Jessica has been doing that kind of also explores breath. But to begin with, Stephen, Posenenske intended for these works to have the kind of objective kind of quality of an industrial product. But I feel like we use the word objective all the time in art speak and don't always define kind of what we mean by it. What do you think in this context that word function? How does that word function in this context? And how is this perceived when encountering these industrial objects within the kind of frame of a museum, even if that museum is an industrial building itself?
Yeah, I think that's a really relevant question for this building in general and also for this exhibition. And Posenenske was talking about this idea of the objective character of these industrial products. So I was kind of thinking about what that meant. And yes, we use the word or the phrase very frequently, but kind of questioning whether or not that's really possible. Is it possible that an industrial object is objective? I think, in trying to think about the common usage of those words, potentially the idea of it being objective is because it has use value, right? So it's objective because it's functional, but then that would also extend that function is objective, which I think it's certainly not, right? So we know that things are designed and potentially they try to hide behind objectivity, they try to hide behind their functionality, but in reality that functionality is very pointed and often very subjective. People are designers, people in power, that are designing urban spaces are thinking about how to design things to make specific things happen, right? So I was first kind of struck by that idea that objectivity is potentially not very possible, but that maybe Posenenske was just thinking about trying to place these objects in that idea of seeing them as useful objects and not seeing them as art objects. So potentially that use of objectivity is to negate this idea of expression that we might often associate with artworks and to foreground the participatory elements of them, to really think about them as ways in which people would use them to create configurations in a social, collaborative sense. So that was like my first thought there. And then beginning to think about, okay, how do they function here in this space? For me, I think it's very hard personally to not see these works as art, right? Because we are in a context that would ask us to do that. But potentially here in this particular configuration, we're also seeing I'm seeing a layer of participation of the kind of process by which these particular sculptures or non-sculptures were created. And so it's funny because I think in asking how the industrial functions here, it makes me think of the fact that it's very difficult to see things not as art. In fact, that so difficult, in fact, that often I'll overhear people that are walking, I think it's just around the corner there, and between these, and there's a fire extinguisher. And, pausing and being like, because we enter into a state of looking in the galleries, right? Where everything can kind of fall into the possibility of being considered art. So I was thinking in a way that it's actually a bit of an inverse, right? That we're seeing these configurations that are industrial, that have resonance with industrial forms here in the gallery, and we're potentially considering them as art. And maybe what's really happening for me, I'll say, is that when I go out into the world, there's that after image out in the world, where it's that actually functional, actually objective, actually useful HVAC system is now kind of resonating with the possibility of being placed in a gallery or having had some kind of collaborative creative history behind it. Oh, yeah. And to kind of build off of that, Jessica, and thinking about what we were able to gather in your studio, I think one thing, we think about this idea of conflating the individual subject with the industrial. So both approaches, yours and Posenenske, seem to introduce a human element to the industrial, either through collective action, as we're saying here in this participatory format, or through the individual body. So I'm wondering if you can talk, or in the case of your work, so I'm wondering if you can talk to us a bit about your works that conflate the body with the industrial, and kind of what's at the heart of that interest for you.
Yeah, so in my practice, I use a lot of materials that I procure from sites of labor, sites of workplaces, ones that I'm usually familiar with, public infrastructure like city buses and trains, and then also thinking about very intimate spaces that I've sort of come across as well via medical facilities or even what can be structurally considered the home. And so for me, I'm really invested in the fact of thinking through the particularity of how infrastructure and architecture and even economic concerns all leave some sort of imprint on the body in very particular ways, and whether it's perceivable on a very direct level, or if in fact it's not necessarily the most perceivable thing. For me, it's really important to sort of investigate and go through understanding what that imprint might actually resonate as or might become, I guess, within the artwork itself. So in a lot of my most recent works, for example, that they saw in the studio, I'm working with pneumatic sculptures where they are all timed to be thinking through the logic of HVAC systems and the air that goes through buildings, and also thinking through breathing exercises that people sort of go through either through like for health reasons or therapy for that matter. So I'm thinking about the body in relationship to architecture specifically through how air is sort of transposed through systems of architecture and also the body itself. And these exist as these balloons that inflate and deflate to different sizes. And as well, I'm also working through a series of drawings where it's taking the language of care of plants themselves and also economic conditions that sort of exist and butt up against the care of the actual individual or the human body. So it's bringing together information from very different sources, but really trying to recognize how the imprint of these different structures sort of impact the body in different ways. And I think a lot about Charlotte's work in relationship to that, where she's bringing out clearly to the fore, right, these HVAC systems that were really sealed within inside corporate buildings, corporate infrastructure, sort of the international style of architecture, and bringing it out into the center and giving this opportunity for people to actually experience it in different ways through play, which I know is something that's pretty central to thinking about this. Sorry, this installation here at DIA.
Yeah, so maybe on that, I can never tell. It's on, right, still? On that front, the current iteration of this exhibition, as I mentioned, is kind of crowdsourced. We played with models. And the exercise was adapted, as I said, from this earlier one that we had done with Diana Mangazer and Stephen in 2019. And I'm still struck by how different it is to understand these objects when you have to try and put them together, right? They kind of, you think you understand what's going to fit where, and then you put it together and you're like, oh no, those pieces can never connect. It's made me much better at Duplo, which I play a lot of at home, my 2-year-old. But how do you think, Stephen, working with the models changes one's understanding of the objects and the systems that the objects themselves kind of reproduce?
Well, I first want to, I don't know if Diana's here, but I wanted to shout out and say those models were brilliantly rendered. And
They're works of art unto themselves.
They were really gorgeous. So I think that was kind of the first step in enabling us to have an experience with the models on that scale, or the work on that scale. I think, you mentioned the idea of playing with Legos, and you mentioned kind of also the idea of there being kind of surprising elements of how these different pieces fit together. I would say that working with these on a model scale really allowed us to be playful, right? Because if you imagine moving these and playing with these objects on this scale, I think that would have introduced a whole another element of maybe collective labor to try to get some of these forms together. And I'm kind of curious about the install of that and kind of how that looked in a way. But when we were all together, gathered, socially distanced to kind of play with these different configurations, it really became a process in which I feel we gained fluency with the system, right? So because you're not immediately, it's not super intuitive. There's certain forms that kind of turn you around a little bit, or they're different sizes. The connection points are different sizes. So over time, we had about like an hour and a half or so. It started to feel like each of us was gaining a kind of fluency that allowed us to begin to be expressive. So I would say that was something that kind of happened, was that the individual was beginning to use the system like a language in which they could express some kind of interiority potentially. So I would say that I feel like it's evident here. I mean, there's some forms where you see like the very linear repetition. You see the form in the middle, or the one right before the door that feels like it's kind of almost getting out of control. And so you kind of begin to realize that these are kind of expressions of self through the system of these objects. And that was a really interesting turn to make, and to be able to tap into that playfulness through the objects.
There's something about them, like they invite you to kind of misuse something that has a really functional use, right? Because they are, especially the galvanized steel pieces, are genuinely HVAC systems, right? They're, she's made some custom shapes, but they function exactly the same way, or they could function exactly the same way, right? So she's kind of inviting you to a kind of misuse, and I think it's interesting because your work also, Jessica, has a kind of, not a there's not a deliberate misuse, but there's a kind of intervention into the existing system, which reframes your understanding of it, but lets the system also kind of be present. But I think collaboration is also something that happens in your work in different ways. And I know that when Stephen and I were in your studio, we were really fascinated by the work that you did with the Postal Service in particular. But you've also collaborated with passengers on public buses and the public in general. So kind of what is that interactive role, or what is the role of kind of collaboration in your own thinking about how the work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think for me, collaboration is kind of seen through the everydayness of the materials that I work with, trying to think through my own process and relationships to how different information comes to the fore in the practice, and how, again, that material is used in the everyday. So for me, that collaboration could look as, thinking through the sites of labor that I encounter every day and use information from, to the project I did with using the bus, I shouldn't call them bus seats, but the train inserts from the actual seats on the public transit, having to go through different formal and informal connections of getting that material to actually make that project happen and come to fruition, was really about the personal contacts and making the direct ask for that sort of procurement. So there are different lines of trying to think through the actual material itself, through the process of procuring information or procuring material, and then also trying to sort of mess with the logic of what the structure should actually look like, either on site in the exhibition space or in the real world. And I think this sort of reflects back to the idea of the worker and what sort of proposition that they could have within these, constructs of, what architecture should look like, what the infrastructure should look like. I feel like if you can insert yourself into that, sort of way of working that you're not supposed to be in, there's the potential for different ways that structures, can actually work for everyone, right? That they don't have to solely exist for those in power, for those who have immediate access. But if there's a way in which, you can, sort of insert yourself in there, we can totally screw with the structure and have it become something different.
I'm going to just describe very briefly the work that you're talking about, where you were collaborating with a lot of different people to actually procure the material. You took the cast-off, basically, material from when a train seat is covered, right? So they use a model.
The upholstery itself from the seat inserts of public transportation in the city of Chicago. You can also see it in London. You can also see it in DC, where there's that fuzzy upholstery, essentially, that is wrapped around a fiberglass shell. So I was getting a hold of those from the construction yards in Chicago, where they were sort of, taking apart the seats and so forth. And so I was procuring that material from the city, and then I'm inserting those on the wall in different configurations and exhibition spaces. Oftentimes they mimic the interior of the train cars themselves with 36 seats. Sometimes it mirrors the interior of other public institutions, like public schools, for example, with the way in which the inserts are actually presented on the wall. So there's this back and forth language where I'm inserting myself into these administrative structures or centers of bureaucracy to obtain this material that, quite frankly, sits on the interior space. And I think a lot about Charlotte's work, where these are within the interior of the building, to really reconsider, this logic that we have of systems and structures that clearly embed themselves on the body in very particular ways, whether it's through segregation or whether it's through economic concerns. This material has a very specific rendering and reading on the body.
Yeah, I think also when you layer those pieces on top of each other too, and you can see the kind of subtle differentiation between one cut and the next. Just that differentiation happens even just with how the fabric frays from one cut to the next, right? There's this, not to anthropomorphize them, but they start to kind of index the labor or the people themselves who have kind of cut these fabrics or who've been manning the machines who do the cutting in a way, right? They kind of build up the individuality of each sheet ends up kind of building that tension out. I wanted to ask you also if you could just describe the work that you did with the postal system, because it's kind of inserting yourself into its system in a very different way.
Yeah. So for that sort of ongoing body of work, I've been sending out dummy mail. I call it dummy mail because I'm sending it off to addresses that are slightly off from the actual location. And I've been picking locations where acts of public violence have occurred, where there have been like historical references to, overturning of specific historical sites, to very specific places of commodity and entertainment. So anything from, let's say, Disneyland to something on the very other extreme, which would be, the uprising with John Brown as a historical reference to the killing of Trayvon Martin. And I'm thinking about these different sites as ways in which capital and also, clearly, destructive circumstances or instances have happened. And so I'm sending this mail off to addresses that are just slightly off from where these public acts have actually occurred. The mail is coming back to me, and all of that sort of residual information or information that is very specific to that location in terms of the barcodes that exist are material that I am indexing and making into these new works that to me really render themselves as landscapes that have been deemed as such by the workers themselves, by the machines that are used to index the barcode, by the organization and structure of the post office as we know it in terms of how addresses and systems are made. And so these right now exist as very large imprinted prints essentially, or drawings on canvas. And there's also this relationship to the post office itself as a site of labor, and the murals that existed there, the WPA murals that exist on many of these sites as locations of understanding American infrastructure as pictured and recognizing that sort of relationship. So I guess there's a little bit of that art historical reference back to thinking about those murals and thinking about a landscape and how that could be visualized differently. But then also thinking about the coming together of these different sites and the fact that commerce and that violence and that the economy in some capacity, they all link together through this system that we all know as the post office.
Yeah. I feel like that's a really good segue to our next question, but do you want to ask it?
Sure.
I feel like it was your brainchild.
Well, Posenenske states that the work does not represent anything other than itself, or that there's an attempt for this work to not represent anything other than itself, which I personally find a difficult proposition for anything. I mean, I feel like all art is representative of something, but I understand it's more of a directionality towards how we might view this work. So can you share how you hold the notion of representation in your work? A lot of the things, the work you just described, I felt, and the other work that we saw in your studio, it felt as if the objects could be considered products of a data collection process, such as the one you just described, or an average of sorts, or some kind of data that you've collected. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for me, representation is never a stable thing. It's always about the confluence of all this different information sort of coming together to create a form to think about how sort of material exists in the world. And I think to your description earlier about the upholstery from the manufacturer, for me, I'm interested in these representations that are unstable, and I'm hoping that the material choices that I make are representative of that sort of unstable quality that we have for how we're picturing the body, how we're picturing how these systems, or thinking these systems should work for us or against us. So yeah, it is the building together of time and space in very, shifting manners, right? And so, like the use of, like the new project with the balloons, just like thinking about trying to inflate and deflate something with air, which is an unstable, matter. Air is unstable, and trying to figure out that composition, thinking about how it could be rendered. I like the fact that it's not something that can be controlled, but is really about the time and space being very poignant in how it is formed, essentially. It's never the same.
Yeah, that's, using the word unstable is really interesting for me in relationship to your work, and actually Posenenske's as well, because they both have a kind of, there's something unfixed about them, but material choices are incredibly important, I think, in both cases. Posenenske using galvanized steel because that was what the material actually was, and then cardboard because it was light. And she wanted people to be able to easily interact with it. And it had a kind of lack of, it was not precious, right? It was a really easy, discardable material that she thought would be kind of inviting, both practical and maybe inviting to the actual interaction. But material choice, I mean, I feel like you're so precise also about your materials and how you're selecting them. Could you kind of talk about that process, how you're arriving at the form and kind of where the research begins and the object, or the research ends and the object begins, or vice versa?
Yeah, there's a lot of back and forth. I think for me, oftentimes, my material choices start with some sort of inference into a particular experience, like a bodily experience with a material or with a site, with an institution, right? I think that a lot of the choices originate with like thinking about experience as being something that is very particular to understanding how the body functions in the world, and that coincides or is in conversation with something that may be more scientific or maybe more rooted in information or specifications that are deemed as universal, right? So there's this back and forth relationship between understanding what I would consider sort of my own personal encounters with something, almost in the fluxus sense, as you were talking about with Charlotte's work, but then also recognizing that it butts up against a different type of expertise. And so there's a relationship with like picking material because I know how it functions and I know what it's done. But then I also go back and like try to understand where does this historically sit? Like, why is this material or infrastructure or architecture really important to the site and to this moment? Or how has it positioned my body in relationship to all these other structures that it plays up against? So again, economic or work concerns, or thinking about, just the everyday and the mundane of trying to get from one location to another. So I try to take in all of this information simultaneously, and it can be rather crazy in my studio, but that's sort of how I like to sort of work, is to try to really figure out the positioning of not just my subjectivity, but like how others maybe have interacted or will interact with that particular type of material.
I feel like that's an interesting segue to the work that you've been doing with light lately as well. Like, so not only is it a kind of corollary to air in being a kind of intangible in some way, right? Something you can't control or bound in typical ways for an object, but also something that is shifting and experienced differently by everyone, like, not only where you sit relative to an office, but how you experience sight in the first place. Anyway, so I was wondering, could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I
work?
mean, in relationship to obviously thinking about air and the breath, about a year or two ago, I started, right before the pandemic, I started a body of work thinking about light and its relationship to work and how it situates the body, essentially. And like Charlotte's work, I was thinking about these structures that are often hidden, that aren't placed to the fore in the center of a building, or again, matter that can't necessarily be captured in any particular way, but has a direct relationship to the body and how we function. And so, yeah, I was really interested in this way of working where I was trying to sort of identify, well, like, how can light be something that can be just described in a way that sort of articulates the fact that it has a huge sort of rendering of how work is sort of seen and how the body is seen. So I've been working on this very large project where I'm just simulating light that is at its brightest point is at its brightest point when an exhibition space is closed, and is at its dimmest point when the exhibition space is open. So mimicking this sort of 24/7 rotation of how work in the body is monitored and sort of captured and sort of recalibrated into something else. And then also thinking about light being captured in almost a survey sort of way, in a very weird way, back to what Charlotte then started to do after the fact with her practice, with trying to capture light as like a survey of anything and everything that was happening in that space in 24 hours. So I'm literally doing light meter readings in different spaces of work throughout the day and capturing both the natural light and the artificial light and making new readings from that as interpretations of that workday or what the body is actually encountering.
To kind of go back to this idea of thinking about the lens of whether or not something is recognizable as artwork or not. Posenenske intended for the work to be decreasingly recognizable as art. And I think that, again, was to kind of foreground and highlight this participatory nature of it. So in your studio, we looked at, and you described this postal service work that's currently ongoing, and your process in which you're kind of misusing the system, and connected that to this idea of landscape. So I'm kind of curious if you can elaborate more on the idea of how that relates to landscape painting and your use of landscape painting as like an entrance point into the experience of this work, in a way that I feel like is maybe in contrast to how Posenenske is asking us to look at these objects as not art. So I thought that was curious how you might use art to
Right.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's a happy accident where you're like finding these relationships that are there, that have, art historical, like proper, capital A. But yeah, I mean, oftentimes when I'm thinking about the materials or the site that I'm interested in, there is a lot of like historical research going into trying to think about how these sites are used, why they're used in the way that they are, and how they, again, link back to the body. And so, those murals were just like an obvious sort of reference point for me to actual labor that occurred there on site, that then like doubled down on the fact that labor was happening and that we were building this infrastructure that was supposed to be made and used for everyone. So it felt fitting in a way for me, at least, to take the scale of those marks that come from the machine of the letter carrier and blow it up to a scale where it became, this is part of the architecture, this is part of the landscape, proper, like to a scale where you have to identify it as such, and like hold on to that relationship that actually became part of the architecture and part of, sort of the character of those sites. So in that work, it felt fitting to see that connection and to sort of understand that that was actual labor that was happening, that was rendered as such, and people were, seen as art workers in that site when they made those murals. Even if some were made there, some were brought there, but generally speaking, like that work as being something that was seen as labor.
Yeah, I feel like there's some type of, and I'm still trying to articulate it, but there's a connection between, I know we're also referred to as consumers here within this installation, and maybe viewers of landscape painting, and that both are kind of proposing that you do a imaginative shift as you're looking at the work. And that's something that I really enjoyed when we were looking at those works in progress in your studio, was that I was looking at them and knowing that I could intentionally place this lens of landscape painting on top of them, the markings started to carry formal weight that they wouldn't have otherwise. And I think that just lended a certain level of engagement with it. And so here I feel like, and what I mentioned earlier with the idea of encountering these forms in the outside world, you can start to do that imaginative kind of twist. And there's just something really kind of delightful about that, I suppose.
Yeah, and even with the works mentioned earlier, with the cutouts from the upholstery that were the scraps left over from the assembly line of those producing the seat inserts, it's that is the work. Yeah. That is like that. It's not the pattern. It's what is cut out, what is removed, what is sort of left to the side and cast away as sort of the non-important thing. I felt was what you're talking about, that way that you sort of insert the work or this question of labor, this question of autonomy onto it, right, is a thing that people sort of dismiss or see as, not complete.
Yeah. With those works in particular, but I think also true for the postal works too, in formal terms, it almost describe it like you're foregrounding the negative space, right?
Yeah.
The thing that happens with the postal landscapes, we'll call them, maybe. It's what's happening almost between send and receipt, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That the work emerges from, this kind of liminal in-between space, where the shifting of also your understanding of the system and how that system is feeding into other systems which contribute to structural racism, just economic disenfranchisement, all of the things that are embodied by the particular sites. Those shifts are happening in that in-between space, and the negative space, obviously, of the fabric is what the image is, right? The after image is the image. After image, by the way, is going to be my takeaway phrase from this, so thanks for that, Steve. Before we turn it over to the audience for questions, I just wanted to ask you one more very on brand for Dia question that kind of came out for me from a quote from one of your most recent publications on sale in the bookshop if you guys want it, where you say there's this idea that anyone should be able to you're talking about international style office buildings.
Yeah.
There's this idea that anyone should be able to occupy these spaces, modular kind of office infrastructure. But there are many ways in which racial differences and whiteness as a construct make this virtually impossible. And when I was reading this, I was thinking that could almost be a direct quote from Anna Chave talking about minimalism. And so much of your work, as Meg Onley, who curated the ICA show, has pointed out, is about kind of surfacing erasure. Yet you have also seems to have such strong ties to minimalism as a movement, as we know, dominated by a bunch of dudes, particularly white dudes in the mid-1960s who were really interested in industrial materials, and labor is kind of backdrop of that work, but not foregrounded in the kind of objective object, to go back to our first question. So I'm just wondering kind of how you approach minimalism as a kind of capital M category, if at all, if it's even relevant for you in your own thinking.
I mean, I think as an artist and you think about the people who came before you and you're working in concert with, obviously aesthetic questions come to the fore, and minimalism has been one of them. But I think for grounding this question of labor into the conversation about minimalism, and specifically labor that happens outside of the context of art making, is really important because it lends to possibilities, right? And again, back to Charlotte's work, infinite possibilities about expectations for what representation can be, and also this idea of inserting yourself into a system that typically does not have you there or has, historically represented you. I think when you're able to allow for different combinations of things, or you're looking into the worker's hand and not just the mechanical reproduction of something, or the structural constructing of something or of the material, there's the possibility for, hiccups to happen, for new things to come to the fore, right? There's an opportunity for the worker's hand or the labor to infuse something that's never been there before. And so I think that oftentimes that's sort of what's overlooked in the conversation about labor. We think of the economy, we think of larger institutions, we think of big business and all of those things, but oftentimes, as we know, labor themselves is left out of the equation. But infinite possibilities can be made true if in fact we consider their conversation. So I think for me, that's why I'm interested in that sort of dialogue, right? Especially if you think of late capitalism and how things are created, it's through these sort of constructions of something being infinite and forever. And I think it can become even more refined when we consider the person who's actually making it. So.
Thank you. So, any questions from the audience? From you guys? I'll give you a minute to think about it. I think there's something really interesting to me also about how one of the things your work does in its material specificity is also ask us to maybe revisit and look at and think about the materials that we associate with minimalism. I mean, even with Posenenske's work, differently, right? You're asking us to kind of index an embodied history as opposed to just the kind of, as you said, systematic or infrastructural system, right? And I think that's an incredible challenge to pose to kind of relooking. Did I see a hand? Okay. Oh, Dan's gonna do it. Awesome. Thanks, Dan. Try again.
Hello. Oh,
Yeah.
gosh.
We can hear you.
First off, thank you, everyone. This is lovely to hear, and in this space with the work that is occurring. One thing that you brought up, Jessica, and I've heard echoed through the work as well as you've been talking about it, is systems and their legislation of possibility in some ways, right? Within this work, you have these pieces like Legos, but you can only build what is compatible. Or like you were saying with working with the models and then bringing those into real life, the friction that occurs with the compatibility of the pieces in creating these constructions. And your comments about labor, of how we're reconfiguring labor or looking at the systems in which labor operates and building these outcomes. I guess I was curious in general to just hear what you have to say about the reconfiguration of labor, how that's being made present in these physical spaces, or how we can see this creating new things out of these familiar spaces. So with the HVAC systems, taking these familiar things, these institutional things, and through reconfiguration, through labor and through play, creating new forms which could signal new possibility, I guess. If any of that's comprehensive, it makes sense to some degree.
Well, I think if I put on my historical hat a little bit and I think about the time in which she was making these works, I mean, it was a time where again, we've talked about this, all of this was hidden, right? It was hidden within the crevices of the building. The worker didn't control the temperature. They still don't in a building or the airflow. And also too, there was this reckoning with thinking about efficiency and energy in a different capacity, right? They were thinking about how to conserve energy and not necessarily the comforts of the body itself. So the fact that she was putting these on display when she was in a format where you could actually change things, move them around, have this sense of autonomy with the material itself, I think for me sort of goes back to your point about what else could be made from it. I think that action in and of itself as it's not a performance, but just the sharing of space in that way was the thing, right? Instead of these forms as sitting proper as sculpture. It was the actual movement and collaboration, I guess, as consumers to make something new out of something that no one else could grasp other than those who had control of the architecture and the infrastructure.
Yeah, that reminds me of something that Burkhard Brunn, Posenenske's widower, once said to me about installing the works, which was that he always felt it was important to have some element where you could see the opening into them so that you had this kind of visual signal that the system is never closed, right? That there's always another possible configuration. You can always add on to it or extend to it. But I think that kind of the flux of that is precisely at the heart of what the thing is in the work.
During the presentation because I was unfamiliar with your work and I was looking at images. And I'm really interested in your relationship to and your thoughts about history of science and technology. And I was thinking in terms of art history, what neighborhood am I in? And I first, not knowing the work, sort of came to thinking back I saw, years ago seeing Pepona Sorio's social worker's desk installation or the installation with a judge's bench. And then I thought, okay, well, that's about labor, it's about a workplace, but the aesthetic's very different. This sort of level of personalization in those spaces are very different. But I think he was still getting at those systems. And then I thought, I saw your earlier works about these trays, and I was really fascinated by the nail tray, the different types of trays. And I work in a history of science museum, and we had a historian of nursing, and she gave this really riveting talk about nursing procedure trays and their relationship to the sequence of how that work is done and to the manuals that were written about how it should be done and how nurses would modify it. And so in any case, lastly, I think a lot about Steve Shapin, historian of science and technology, has a really nice piece called Invisible Science about the systems behind McDonald's, And so, I don't know, I think this is a really interesting neighborhood that you're in, the sort of both formally and art historically, but also within the systems studies, I think, that are happening in history of science and technology as well. So that's more of a reflection than a question, but if that evokes anything for you, I'd be happy.
Yeah, thank you. That's really insightful and precise. There's just something about when and I'm sure there are other artists who think in this capacity too, but when I'm thinking about aesthetics, or when I'm thinking about materials and being a maker, there is always a crossover into other spaces or just spaces of being as a person, right? Like, we talked again a lot about like fluxus, right? And to me, like, the ideas around that are, I'm thinking about like feminism. I'm thinking about like being in a room, talking to other people, talking about other women about their experiences in terms of dealing with, you know, particular sites of the body or references to that, and that being a way of understanding how space works, how systems work. And like in her work, right, that was through other people interacting as consumers with this material itself. So I think the languages cross over, and when I'm thinking about systems, I'm thinking about like how materials interact with one another. But the way in which I understand how materials interact with one another is because precisely of how they work in the everyday and in the real world. And, you know, I'm obviously trying to understand how they work, but I think the only way to really like get at how these things are like functioning for us or not as consumers is to really obviously play with the material, but understand its history and understand how the connections are made or not made. So yeah, I'm trying to, in this new work, really get into some places of thinking about energy production, like literally, and thinking about the breath and like the human body and how those things interact. I mean, there's plenty of, as you know, material on that written about.
Time for one more question after that.
It's really exciting to think about, say, those nail salon trays in relation to the postal code work, because you know, it makes me think of like the immigration systems that bring someone from Vietnam to like the postal code where their salon is, and you know, the history of polymers that like make those nail polishes, or all those family networks that, you know, put labor into the nail salon. So I don't know, it's really, thinking across your body of work seems very compelling as well. Thanks.
Thank you.
Wait, hold on. Dan's got to turn you off.
I was wondering about the like breathing thing at the beginning. Was that something all three of you came up with? The like breathing exercise at the beginning, and we were listening for the HVAC system. Is that something all three of you guys came up with together?
I'm just currently working through those different ways of thinking about and experiencing air in my studio, as abstract as that sounds. But I'm thinking about those connections right now in the work, and pacing and size and scale, and how that starts to become something different as you insert these different rhythms and patterns into material.
We were chatting about a week ago about what we should talk about today and how we should do it. Stephen and I were reflecting on that work that we had seen in the studio and its relationship to Posenenskes, and also maybe a little bit to breathing all together in a post-pandemic or mid-pandemic, wherever we are in the cycle space, and how, I don't know, maybe different a register that takes on now than it might have 2 years ago. And without wanting to be heavy-handed about it, kind of wanted to anchor some of the ideas that flow throughout this work kind of in the body.
In your work, okay, there I am. Actually, that's kind of a weird analog for what I'm about to ask, but the idea of I walked away from your studio really feeling this sense of like, to put it in very, very basic terms, like me, like an individual versus like this very large, kind of almost imperceivably large system. right? And the idea of the HVAC system and kind of tuning into our own breaths is I felt like a way to kind of illuminate that disparity. Yeah, I kind of, I don't know if that resonates with you. I kind of see, in a way, you as like an interlocutor within these systems. And in a way, you are creating an opening for us as viewers and people who experience the work to kind of step into that role of being an interlocutor, of understanding how there's possibility there, but also how there is a huge, like a huge kind of blockade, or it's really myopic, or it's unfathomably large, or it's like, you know, it's so deeply embedded in some kind of a system that is embedded with injustice or embedded with a lack of consideration for, you know. So I don't know what, I'm not sure if I can articulate what that's doing for me, but I know I felt that in your studio. Yeah.
No, I think the term like interlocutor is like a really good way of describing, I think, what the work is doing in this moment, or at least what I'm experiencing in the studio, because it isn't diaristic, right? Like it's really about like trying to shift through all of this material, all these different locations and sites, and find an opening, right? Just like find a way in which some of this becomes a little bit more perceivable about how things are sort of acting as systems, acting with or against each other. So, yeah.
Okay, I think with that, I'm going to say thank you so much for joining us. This was such a pleasure. And thank you all for coming, and have a great rest of your Saturday.